Hello, I'm Scott Thompson, and welcome to After 10. The United States, with its back against the wall, came to an agreement last week on ending a partial government shutdown and avoiding a national default. On today's After 10, we take a look at the situation in the United States and how it could affect us here in Korea.
Including the budget for the Affordable Care Act, there were other issues and political conflicts between the Democratic and Republican parties. After several dramatic days of negotiations, an agreement was made on October 16th, ending the shutdown and averting a national default. However, the agreement only pushed back the issues until early next year, and because it's only a temporary fix, the U.S. economy is still mired in uncertainty. Because of the gridlock, the U.S. is not expected to taper its quantitative easing program now until sometime next year. The events of the past few weeks left a huge impact on the U.S., and the world economy too was greatly affected. Today on After 10, we diagnose the impact of the U.S. gridlock not only on the U.S. and Korean economies, but to the world economy as well. And to prepare for similar future situations, we look into what countermeasures the Korean economy can take.
Professor Oh, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me here.
Now, a partial government shutdown that lasted for more than 2 weeks, avoiding the national default by just hours. For those that haven't been paying attention all that closely to the situation in the United States over the past few weeks, could you give us a rundown of what we've seen?
I think all the world economy, including Korean economy, all the world people were embarrassed to see the possibility of the default and the shutdown of the U.S. economy, because of the U.S. economy is number one in the world. So if the U.S. economy have default, all the world economy will be affected seriously, including Korean economy also. So I think just more than 2 weeks, many Korean people were so much worried about the U.S. economic situation. But now, very fortunately, even temporarily, they have agreement to solve the default and government shutdown issues.
And the world and many Americans look at the situation there and wonder how the politicians let it get that far. How far, or how did they let this get so far down the road before almost defaulting on the economy there?
That's right, almost equal, just the final deadline, they had the agreement. I think that this is mostly the political issue, political risk in the U.S. Because of the next year, U.S. will have a midterm election. So considering the midterm election, both parties actually now is fighting each other to get more votings. Because the Obamacare is a policy to provide health care with about 15 million people in the U.S. So mainly the benefit of 50 million people will be maybe a support to the Democrat, while the increasing tax burden, more tax burden will be borne to the Republican supporters. That's why I call the political risk, political issues, rather than economic issues.
But again, and people look at the situation there and they wonder, how can you play a game like this over something like the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, when the economy is barreling down the tracks to default? I mean, that's the question here, right?
That's right. Because basically, in the next year budget, Obamacare budget is included. I believe about $5 million are included there. So in case of Republic, they cannot concede because of considering the next midterm election. But in case of Democrat, also they must include $5 million. That's why I think even though the temporary resolution, maybe I think early next year, maybe January or February, they might have another fighting each other, more serious fighting, I think so, yeah.
And as far as the Republicans go, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, was the center of all of this, of course. But knowing full well that President Obama was not going to back away from his signature legislation from his first term in office, You talked about the politics surrounding all of this.
Yeah.
What is the end game there for the Republicans? I mean, what do they really hope to accomplish?
Actually, considering the U.S. situation, many Korean people were embarrassed to hear in the U.S. More than 15 million people have not benefited health care because of in Korea, all the Korean people are enjoying the healthcare system. So I think in case of Republic also, they cannot be against such system. But the Republican argues this system is okay, but next year we cannot include next year because of if they include the next year budget, that issue will be more political issues rather than economic issues. That's why Republican argues but they must include they must delay 1 year more. That means that after midterm election, because of the U.S. must avoid political risk. But in case of Democrats, they must include the next year budget. That's why I think even 2 or 3 months later, they may be very difficult to have agreement on Obamacare.
And given the uncertainty, given the gridlock that we've seen over the past several weeks and months, looking at the economy in the U.S., where does it stand right now?
That's why, due to the next more than 2 weeks deadlock on shutdown and default, U.S. economy now already paid a lot of cost. In particular, federal government didn't spend their money more than 2 weeks, and also many consumers also recently U.S. consumer sentiment index declined. That means many consumers also are reluctant to use their money. That means the consumption on government and consumption on private sector will decrease. Finally, as a result, U.S. economy growth rate in the fourth quarter of this year will decline by about 0.5%. So I think that is very important because of the U.S. economy now is on the road to recovery from the 2008 financial crisis, but on the road, very weak recovery, road to recovery. But now U.S. economy had a big damage. That's why many Korean people, many world economic analysts are worried about the recovery, the robustness of recovery of the U.S. economy.
And U.S. President Barack Obama, after the deal, said damage had been done to the U.S. economy and the world economy as a whole. What sorts of damage are we talking about in the short term as well as in the long term?
I think in the short term, U.S. economy already have paid a lot of cost. For instance, common consumption already have been cut during less than more than 2 weeks. And also the consumer also now consumption confidence have been declined already. For instance, U.S. Consumer sentiment index declined recently. So I think considering such government spending and also the private consumption, fourth quarter in the U.S. Growth rate will decline by about 0.5%. So there's such a decline in the U.S. economy growth rate in the short term will damage to the world economy as well. Because now U.S. economy is on the road to recovery. So the U.S. economic confidence on the recovery of the U.S. economy, I think will damage to the confidence of the recovery of the world economy. And on the other side, looking at the long-term perspective, many economists think this is the physical issue in the U.S. economy because of for instance, Professor Logo of Harvard University argued that if any country's ratio of government debt to GDP increases more than 90%, that economy will have a big damage. But very unfortunately, in the U.S. already, the ratio is more than 100% already. Additionally, due to the Obamacare, that ratio will increase more. I think U.S. economy in the long term have a big damage. So the growth rate will be lower than the growth rate before the U.S. financial crisis. So there is a general economists' forecast or consensus. And if the U.S. economy will have such issues in the long term, that also because the U.S. economy is the largest economy in the world, nowadays occupying 22% of the world GDP. So if the U.S. economy growth engine will decline, naturally, old world economy will be damaged. There's long-term issues.
And there's all this uncertainty now, of course. They did come to an agreement last week, but it's really only a temporary solution.
That's right.
Begging the question, are we going to find ourselves back in the very same place 3 or 4 months from now when the new deadlines come
right.
up?
That's right. As you know, the new deadline is 7th February next year. Also, according to recent agreement, next year budget also will be settled by the mid-January of next year. So in case in January or February, or I think in January, a lot of extreme uncertainty will take place in the U.S. economy as well as in the world. That's a big problem. Also, that uncertainty is not easy to be resolved because of the next year midterm election. That problem, I think so.
And in a greater sense, too, many people wonder what can be done to make sure the situation doesn't come again. Are there any solutions out there to make sure that this type of thing, this partial government shutdown, this being on the verge of a national default, that it doesn't happen again?
I think in this case, they must have some concession, because if they will not have any concession, each other, U.S. economy will have a collapse. But I think for instance, Democrat also will reduce the amount of budget of the Obamacare a little bit, while Republican also will increase the tax for the middle class having no benefit of health care. You know, in the U.S., number one country, more than 50 million people have not benefited the healthcare system. This is actually unbelievable situation. So I think both parties should consider a little bit more. So they should reach agreement or compromise. I think January or just 1 day before the deadline in February, they must reach such a compromise.
And there's certainly a lot at stake, of course. Recently, Fitch Ratings put the U.S.'s sovereign credit rating under a negative watch. Back in 2001, we saw S&P also do the same thing, reduce the credit rating, actually reduce it of the United States. Do you think the situation right now is leading us to a similar path? Do you see something like that taking place?
Yeah, that's right. I think, of course, S&P and Fitch and other credit rating agencies are watching the U.S. Both parties' situation. But I think if the U.S. economy will be in default or shutdown again, definitely U.S. credit rating will be downgraded, even to, I think, BB or BBB situation, not AA, because this is a default or shutdown. So I think the U.S. both parties also, in such case, U.S. both parties also will be damaged, because of the U.S. people and all world people will criticize both parties. So I think that's why they must reach the concession. They must avoid such a tragic situation.
The talk of the world a few months ago was about the possible tapering of quantitative easing in the United States. Now, with all this uncertainty, with all we've seen in the past few weeks, that's being talked about not happening this year now. Why not?
Because of according to the forward guideline released by Bernanke, U.S. Fed, the chairman of U.S. Fed, they said, U.S. Fed and Bernanke said, when U.S. unemployment rate will reach to 7%, now 7.3%, actually more than 9% in the crisis period. So the unemployment rate in the U.S. have decreased, now 7.3%. So according to Fed announcement, when U.S. unemployment will reach 7%, U.S. Fed will start tapering. But I think without this default or shutdown, maybe I think the end of this year, many people have expected. But very unfortunately, due to this shutdown and the default problem, U.S. economy will decline in the fourth quarter rather than early expectation. So I think the U.S. employment situation will not improve as expected. So I think maybe early next year, U.S. unemployment rate will reach about 7%. So I think but one more point is the end of January of next year, chairman of Fed will change from Bernanke to Yellen. So I think maybe, but also the other third point is next year, January, FOMC meeting will be held. Also the March, no meeting in the February. So March, FOMC meeting will be held. So I think between January meeting or March meeting, when the tapering will be started, that is another issue. So I think considering January uncertainty on the U.S. economy due to the physical issues, I think Fed may not decide to start tapering in January meeting. So maybe in March meeting, I expect they will start the tapering.
We've looked to the past at the causes for the shutdown and the default situation there in the U.S. We've looked to the future and speculated about what may happen. Let's look to the present right now. In the world economy, in the markets, what effect has the default situation and the shutdown had on the world economy?
I think in particular in the Korean economy, in case of Korean economy, a little bit different from the other emerging economy. Nowadays, with help of the delay in tapering in the U.S. Fed, many U.S. money come to the Korean economy now. During last about 1 month, about more than $10 billion US come to the Korean market now. So that's why now Korean investors enjoying the increase in the Korean stock price. I think this situation will continue 1 or 2 months more because of until early next year, maybe this situation will continue. But on the other hand, we have another issue. Korean exchange rate of won to US dollar decline continuously because of the capital inflow to the Korean market. So yesterday or today, Korean exchange rate declined to the 1,060 or 60. So I think this is another burden to the Korean economy. Also, the many investors, foreign investors, also is watching the situation because of if the Korean exchange rate will decline to the certain point, for instance, 1,050 something like that, Korean authority will have no option but intervene in the foreign exchange market. In that case, foreign investors may have some exchange loss, so they will pull out their money. So it's a very important situation now. So considering the exchange market and the capital market, in case of Korea, I think still we may have some room for stock price to increase more. Also, still more room for foreign investors to invest in Korean market. But you know, in January or February, U.S. economy will have extreme uncertainty on the possible default or possible shutdown. Many foreign money suddenly may flow out from the Korean market, as well as the other emerging economy market. That's why I think very big damage to the emerging financial market. That's a big issue. So in case of other emerging economy whose foreign exchange reserve is not enough, they may have some even foreign exchange risk, foreign exchange crisis. That's a big issue.
The International Monetary Fund recently revised down its economic growth forecast for Korea from 3.9 to 3.7%.
Right.
The Asian Development Bank dropped economic growth forecast from 3.7 to 3.5% recently.
Right.
Why the pessimism now surrounding economic growth in Korea?
First of all, Korean economy, the ratio of dependency on the external demand is more than 50%. That's why as the world economy will decline, Korean export will decline as well. That's big issue. So I think now U.S. economy is the leading economy in the world, is now on the road to recovery. But if the U.S. economy will have some problem, Korean export will also have a problem. That's big issues. On internally also we have now very big issue of low investment. So long time the Korean economy negative growth rate of investment because of so many internal bad environment for investment. For instance, Korean politicians have argued we must more democratize the Korean economy. That means they are arguing more distribution rather than growth. So many new regulation on the investment side. Also, on the consumption side, many consumers have a lot of household debt. We have a lot of household debt still increasing, and also the housing market have stagnated so long times. So household consumption also have been stagnated so long time. So external export and internally investment consumption have been stagnated. That's why Korean economy next year maybe, I hope Korean economy will recover, but situation will not be bright for the recovery.
And given all these factors tugging or pulling down on the Korean economy, should we maybe start being concerned about a prolonged economic slowdown here in the country?
So we have now very important crucial situation because considering the business cycle, we have declined so long times, more than 2 years later. But considering only business cycle, Korean economy now is a turning point to recover. But considering the internal and external situation, Korean economy may fall into another long recession. So now a very important turning point. So if government policy will be effective to encourage investment or to encourage the housing market or to settle the household debt, that policy will be effective. Korean economy will recover. But that policy, otherwise, Korean economy may have another long, prolonged recession.
So I'll ask you the question: how should the Korean government approach all these problems that keep
I think
popping
they
up?
must improve the investment environment more. So that means they must improve. They must develop more investment-friendly environment for increasing investment. That is important one, because for instance in Korea, already wage rate is very high. Also, so many regulation and also very strong labor union compared with other countries, even in the U.S., even Russia, other countries. So I think how Korean government will make more investment-friendly environment. That's very important one.
Professor Oh Jung-gun, thank you very much for being on the show, providing your insights for these very complicated matters. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
And thank you, as always, for watching. We'll see you next time, After 10.